More than 1,000 years before Christ, near the eastern end of the Mediterranean, was a great sea, very rich and powerful, second to none on earth. The name of it was Troy, and even today no city is more famous. The cause of this long-lasting fame was a war told of in one of the world's greatest poems, the Iliad. And the cause of the war went back to a dispute between three jealous goddesses. The Judgment of Paris. The evil goddess of discord, Eris, was naturally not popular in Olympus, and when the gods gave a banquet they were apt to leave her out. Resenting this deeply, she determined to make trouble, and she succeeded very well indeed. At an important marriage, that of King Pelles and the scene of Thetis, to which she alone of all the divinities was invited, she threw into the banquet hall a golden apple marked "For the fairest." Of course all the goddesses wanted it, and in the end the choice was narrowed down to three: Aphrodite, Hera, and Pallas Athena. They asked Zeus to judge between them, but very wisely he refused to have anything to do with the matter. He told them to go to Mount Ida, near Troy, where the young prince Paris, also called Alexander, was keeping his father's sheep. He was an excellent judge of beauty, Zeus told them. Paris, though a royal prince, was doing shepherd's work, because of his father Priam, the king of Troy, had been warned that this prince would some day be the ruin of his country, and so had sent him away. At the moment, Paris was living with a lonely nymph named Oenone. His amazement can be imagined when there appeared before him the wondrous forms of the three great goddesses. He was not asked, however, to gaze at the radiant divinities and choose which of them seemed to him the fairest, but only to consider the brides each offered and choose which seemed to him best worth taking. Nevertheless, the choice was not easy. What men cared for most was set before him. Hera promised to make him lord of Europe and Asia; Athena that he would lead the Trojans to victory against the Greeks, and lay Greece in ruins; Aphrodite that the fairest woman in all the world should be his. Paris, a weakling, and something of a coward too, as later events showed, chose the last. He gave Aphrodite the golden apple. That was the judgment of Paris, famed everywhere, as the real reason why the Trojan War was fought. The Trojan War. The fairest woman in the world was Helen, the daughter of Zeus and Leda, and the sister of Castor and Pollux. Such was the report of her beauty that not a young prince in Greece but wanted to marry her. When her suitors assembled in her home to make a formal proposal for her hand, they were so many and from such powerful families that her reputed father, King, King Tyndareus, her mother's husband, was afraid to select one among them, fearing that the others would unite against him. He therefore extracted a solemn oath from all he therefore extracted first a solemn oath from all that they would champion the cause of Helen's husband, whoever he might whoever he might be. If any wrong was done to him through his marriage, it was, after all, to each man's advantage to take the oath, since each was hoping he would be the person chosen. So they all bound themselves to punish to the uttermost anyone who carried or tried to carry Helen away. When Tyndareus chose Menelaus, the brother of Agamemnon, Agamem, Agamem, Agamemnon, and made him king of Sparta as well. So matters stood when Paris gave the golden apple to Aphrodite. The goddess of love and beauty knew very well that the most beautiful woman on earth was to be found. She led the young shepherd, with never a thought of "oh no," left forlorn, straight to Sparta, where Menelaus and Helen received him graciously as their guest. The ties between guest and host were strong, but each was bound to help and never harm the other. But Paris broke that sacred bond. Menelaus, trusting completely to it, left Paris in his home, and went off to Crete. Then Paris, who coming, entered a friend's king dwelling, shamed the shamed the hand there that gave him food, stealing away a woman. Menelaus got back. Oh, Menelaus Menelaus got back to find Helen gone, and he called upon all Greece to help him. The chieftains responded as they were bound to do. They came eager for the great enterprise, to cross the sea and lay mighty Troy to ashes. Two, however, of the first rank were missing: Odysseus, king of the island of Ithaca, and Achilles, the son of Peleus, and the sea nymph, Thetis. Odysseus, who was one of the shrewdest and most sensible men in Greece, did not want to leave his house and family to embark to a romantic adventure overseas for the sake of the faithless woman. He pretended, therefore, that he had gone mad, and when a messenger from the Greek army arrived, the king was plowing a field and sowing it with salt instead of seed. But the messenger was shrewd too. He seized Odysseus's little son and put him directly in the way of the plow. Instantly the father turned the plow aside, thus proving that he had all his wits about him. However reluctant, he had to join the army. Achilles was kept back by his mother. The sea nymph knew that if he went to Troy he was fated to die there. She sent him to the court of Lycomedes, the king who had treacherously killed Theseus, and made him wear woman's clothes and hide among the maidens. Odysseus was dispatched by the chieftains at, to fight him out. Disguised by the Disguised as a peddler, he went to the court where the lad was said to be, with gay ornaments in his pack such as women love, and also some fine weapons. While the girls flocked around the, trinket, the trinkets, Achilles fingered the swords and daggers. Odysseus knew him then, and he had no trouble at all in making him disregard what his mother had said and go to the Greek camp with him. Whoops. So the great fleet made ready. 1,000 ships carried the Greek host. They met they met at Aulis, a place of strong winds and dangerous tides, impossible to sail from as long as the north wind blew, and it kept on blowing day after day. It broke men's heart, spared not ship nor cattle. The time dragged, doubling itself in passing. The army was desperate. At last the soothsayer Calchas declared that the gods had spoken to him. Artemis was angry. One of her beloved wild creatures, a hare, had been slain by the Greeks, together with her young, and the only way to calm the wind and ensure a safe voyage to Troy was to appease her by sacrificing to her a royal maiden. Iphigenia, the eldest daughter of the commander-in-chief, Agamemnon. Agamemnon. This was terrible to all, but to her father hardly bearable. If I must slay the joy of my house, my daughter, a father's hands, stained with dark streams flowing from blood of a girl, slaughtered before the altar. Nevertheless, he yielded. His reputation with the army was at stake, and his ambition to conquer Troy and exalt Greece. He declared the deed, slaying his child to help a war. He sent home for her, writing his wife that he had arranged a great marriage for her to Achilles, who had already shown himself the best and greatest of all chieftains. But when she came to her wedding, she was carried to the altar to be killed. And all her prayers, cries of "Father, Father," her maiden life, these they held as nothing, the savage warriors, battle mad. She died and the north wind ceased to blow, and the Greek ships sailed out over a quiet sea. But the evil prince they had paid, but the evil price they had paid was bound some day to bring evil down upon them. When they reached the mouth of the Simois, one of the rivers of Troy, the first man to leap ashore was Protesilaus. Protesilaus. It was a brave deed, for the oracle had said that he who landed first would be the first to die. Therefore, when they had fallen by a Trojan spear, Therefore, when he had fallen by a Trojan spear, the Greeks paid him honors, as though he were divine, and the gods, too, greatly distinguished him. They had Hermes bring him up from the dead, to see once again his deeply mourning wife. She would not give him up a second time, however. When he went back to the underworld, she went with him. She killed herself. 1,000 ships carried a great host of fighting men, and the Greek army was very strong. But the Trojan city was strong too. Priam, the king, and his queen, Hecuba, Hecuba, had many brave sons to lead the attack and to defend the walls. One above all, Hector, than whom no man anywhere was nobler or more brave, and only one a greater warrior, the champion of the Greeks, Achilles. Each knew that he would die before Troy was taken. Achilles had been told by his mother, "Very brief is your lot. Would that you could be free from the tears and troubles, and you shall not long endure, my child. Short-lived beyond all men, and to be pitied, no divinity had told Hector, but he was equally sure. I know well in my heart and in my soul," he said to his wife, "the day shall come when holy Troy will be laid low, and Priam's people, both heroes, fought under the shadow of certain death. For 9 years victory wavered, now to this side, now to that. Neither was ever able to gain any decided advantage. Then a quarrel flared up between two Greeks, Achilles and Agamemnon, and for a time it turned the tide in favor of the Trojans. Again, a woman was the reason. Again, a woman was the reason. Chryseis, daughter of Apollo's priest, whom the Greeks had carried off and given to Agamemnon. Her father came to beg for her release, but he would not let her go. Then the priest prayed to the mighty god he served, and Phoebus Apollo heard him. From his son's chariot he shot fiery arrows down upon the Greek army. The men, the men sickened and died, so that the funeral pyres were burning constantly. At last Achilles called an assembly of the chieftains. He told them that they could not hold out against both the pestilence and the Trojans, and that they must either find a way to appease Apollo or else sail home. Then the prophet Calchas stood up and said he knew why the god was angry, but that he was afraid to speak unless Achilles would guarantee his safety. "I do so," Achilles answered. even if you accuse Agamemnon himself. Every man there understood what that meant. They knew Apollo's priest had been treated. When Calchas declared that Chryses must be given back to her father, he had all the chiefs behind him, and Agamemnon, greatly angered, was obliged to agree. But if I lose her, who was my prize and of honor, he told Achilles, I will have another in her stead. Therefore, when Chryses had been returned to her father, Agamemnon sent two of his squires to Achilles' tent to take the prize of honor away from him, the maiden Briseis. Most unwillingly, they went and stood before the hero in heavy silence. But he knew their errand, but he but he knowing their errand told it told them it was not they who were wronging him. They uh, they let them take the girl without fear for themselves. But hear him first while he swore before gods and men that Agamemnon would pay dearly for the deed. That night Achilles' mother, silver-footed Thetis, the sea nymph, came to him. She was angry as he. She told him to have nothing more to do with the Greeks, and with that she went up to heaven and asked Zeus to give success to the Trojans. Zeus was very reluctant. The war by now had reached Olympus. The gods were ranged against each other. Aphrodite, of course, was on the side of Paris. Equally, of course, Hera and Athena were against him. Ares, god of war, always took sides with Aphrodite, while Poseidon, lord of the sea, favored the Greeks, a sea people, always great sailors. Apollo cared for Hector, and for his sake helped the Trojans, and Artemis, as his sister, did so too. And Artemis, as his sister, did so too. Zeus liked the Trojans best, on a whole, but he wanted to be neutral because Hera was so disagreeable whenever he opposed her openly. However, he could not resist. However, he could not resist Thetis. He had a hard time with Hera, who guessed, as she usually did, what he was about. He had driven finally into telling her that he would lay hands upon her if she did not stop talking. Hera kept silence then, but her thoughts were busy as to how she might help the Greeks and circumvent Zeus. The plan Zeus made was simple. He knew that the Greeks without Achilles were inferior to the Trojans, and he sent a lying dream to Agamemnon, Agamemnon, promising him victory if he attacked. While Achilles stayed in his tent, a fierce battle followed, the hardest yet fought. Up on the wall of Troy, the old King Priam and the other older men, wise in the ways of war, sat watching the contest. To them came Helen, the cause of all that agony and death. Yet as they looked at her, they could not feel any blame. Men must fight for such as she, they said to each other, for her face was that for her face was like to that of an immortal spirit. She stayed by them, telling them the names of this and that Greek hero, until to their astonishment the battle ceased. The armies drew back on either side, and in the space between, Paris and Paris and Menelaus, Menen, Menelaus faced each other. It was evident that the sensible decision had been reached most concerned fight to let the two most concerned fight it out alone. Paris struck first, but Menelaus caught the swift spear on his shield, then hurled his own. It rent Paris's tunic, but did not wound him. Menelaus drew his sword, his only weapon now, but as he did so, it fell from his hand, broken. Undaunted though, unarmed, he leaped upon Paris, and seizing him by his helmet's crest, swung him off his feet. He would have dragged him to the Greeks victoriously if it not had been for Aphrodite. She tore away the strap that kept the helmet on, so that it came away in Menelaus's hand. Paris himself, who had not fought at all except to throw his spear, she caught up with a cloud and took back to Troy. Furiously, Menelaus went through the Trojan ranks seeking Paris, and not a man there but would have helped him, for they all hated Paris. But he was gone. No one knew where he was. So Agamemnon spoke to both armies, declaring that Menelaus was victor and bidding the Trojans give Helen back. This was just, and the Trojans would have agreed if Athena, at Hera's prompting, had not interfered. Hera was determined that the war could not end until Troy was ruined. Athena, sweeping down to the battlefield, persuaded the foolish heart of Pandarus, a Trojan, to break the truce and shoot an arrow at Menelaus. He did so and wounded him, only slightly, but the Greeks, enraged at the treachery, turned upon the Trojans, and the battle was on again. Terror and destruction and strife, whose fury never slackens, all friends of a murderous war god, were there to urge men on to slaughter each other. Then the voice of groaning was heard, and the voice of triumph from slayer and from slain, and the earth steamed with blood. On the Greek side, with Achilles gone, the two greatest champions were Ajax and Diomedes. They fought gloriously that day, and many a Trojan lay on his face in the dust before them. The best and bravest next to Hector, the Prince Aeneas, Aeneas came near to death at Diomedes' hands. He was of more than royal blood. His mother was Aphrodite herself, and when Diomedes wounded him, she hastened down to the battlefield to save him. She lifted him in her soft arms, but Diomedes, knowing she was a coward goddess, not one of those who, like Athena, are masters where warriors fight, leaped towards her and wounded her hand. Crying out, she let Aeneas fall, and weeping for pain made her way to Olympus, where Zeus, smiling to see the laughter-loving goddess in tears, bade her stay away from battle and remember hers were the works of love and not of war. But although his mother failed him, Aeneas was not killed. Apollo enveloped him in a cloud and carried him to sacred Pergamos, the holy place of Troy, where Artemis healed him of his wound. But Diomedes raged on. working havoc in the Trojan ranks until he came face to face with Hector. There, to his dismay, he saw Ares, too. The blood-stained, murderous god of war was fighting for Hector. At the sight, Diomedes shuddered and cried to the Greeks to fall back, slowly, however, and with their faces toward the Trojans. Then Hera was angry. She urged her horses to Olympus and asked Zeus if she might drive that bane of men, Ares, from the battle. Zeus, who loved him no more than Hera did, even though he was their son, willingly gave her leave. She hastened down and stand She hasted down to stand beside Diomedes and urge him to smite the terrible god and have no fear. At that, joy filled a hero's heart. He rushed at Ares and hurled his spear at him. Athena drove it home, and it entered Ares' body. The war god bellowed as loud as 10,000 cry in battle, and at the awful sound trembling seized the whole host, Greeks and Trojans alike. Ares, really a bully at heart, and unable to bear what he brought upon unnumbered multitudes of men, fled up to Zeus in Olympus, and complained bitterly of Athena's violence. But Zeus looked at him sternly, and told him he was intolerable as his mother, and bade him cease his whining. With Ares gone, however, the Trojans were forced to fall back. And this crisis a brother of Hector's wife. At this crisis, a brother of Hector's wife, wise in discerning the will of the gods, urged Hector to go with all speed to the city and tell the queen, his mother, to offer to Athena the most beautiful robe she owned, and prayed her to have mercy. Hector felt the wisdom of the advice and sped through the gates to the palace, where his mother did all as he said. She took a robe so precious that it shone like a star, and laying it on the goddess's knees, she besought her, Lady Athena, spare the city and the wives of the Trojans and the little children. But Pallas Athena denied the prayer. As Hector went back to the battle, he turned aside to see once more, perhaps for the last time, the wife his the wife he tenderly loved, Andromache, Andromache, and his son Astyanax. He met her on the wall where she had gone in terror to watch the fighting when she heard the Trojans were in retreat. With her as a handmaid, with her was a handmaid carrying the little boy. Hector smiled and looked at them silently, but Andromache took his hand in hers and wept. My dear lord, she said, you who are father and mother and brother unto me as well as husband, stay here with us. Do not make me a widow, and your child an orphan. He refused her gently. He could not be a coward, he said. It was for him to fight always in the forefront of the battle. Yet she could not know that he never forgot what her anguish would be when he died. This was the thought that troubled him above all else, more than his many other cares. He turned to leave her, but first he held out his arms to his son. Terrified, the little boy shrank back, afraid of the helmet and its fierce nodding crest. Hector laughed, and took the shining helmet from his head. Then, holding the child in his arms, he caressed him and prayed, O Zeus, in after years many men say of this my son when he returns from battle. O Zeus, in after years may men say of this my son when he returns from battle, far greater than he, far greater is he than his father was. So he laid the boy in his wife's arms, and she took him, smiling, yet with tears, and Hector pitied her, and touched her tenderly with his hand, and spoke to her, Dear one, be not so sorrowful. That which is fated must come to pass, but against my fate no man can kill me. Then taking up his helmet, he left her, and she went to her house, often looking back at him and weeping bitterly.